Imagine this moment, a morning in the New Mexico desert that would change the course of human history forever. July 16, 1945, 5:29 and 45 seconds in the morning. In the pre-dawn darkness, beneath a 100-foot steel tower in the middle of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a group of American scientists and military engineers stood at the threshold of a new world. They had invested years of their lives. They had assembled the greatest collection of scientific and engineering talent ever gathered. They had poured billions of dollars into a secret weapon that nobody had ever built before, that nobody had ever tested before, that nobody was even certain would work. And then, at that precise moment, with a flash of light so brilliant it was seen hundreds of miles away, the first atomic bomb in human history detonated. In that single second, everything changed. The old world ended. The nuclear age began. American technological supremacy was revealed to the entire planet in one devastating display of power and engineering mastery that would shake the world and leave America's enemies in absolute shock. This is the story of a triumph so complete, so overwhelming, so utterly beyond what anyone thought possible that it would define American technological superiority for decades to come. This is the story of scientists who witnessed the apocalypse and realized they had created it. This is the story of an American achievement so extraordinary that it would reshape global politics, terrify the Soviet Union, and usher humanity into an age where the power to destroy civilization rested in human hands. But more than anything, this is the story of how American genius, American engineering, American science, and American determination accomplished something that the entire world said was impossible. How American military and scientific leadership achieved what no other nation on earth could achieve, and how that single moment of American triumph left the Soviet dictator Stalin, the most powerful man in the communist world, trembling and realizing in that instant that the balance of power had shifted permanently and that his nation had been left behind by American technological progress. By 1942, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. Hitler had conquered France in just 6 weeks. He had invaded Russia and pushed thousands of miles into Soviet territory. He had occupied Poland, the Balkans, North Africa. The war seemed to be going to the Nazis. And American scientists and military leaders faced a terrifying question. What if Hitler's scientists, some of whom were among the most brilliant physicists in the world, succeeded in developing an atomic bomb first? In 1938, German scientists had discovered nuclear fission. They had figured out that when you split the nucleus of a uranium atom, it releases tremendous energy. The theoretical possibility of an atomic bomb was suddenly very real. American scientists, many of whom had fled Nazi-dominated Europe and had family members still trapped there, understood the stakes with absolute clarity. If Nazi Germany developed an atomic bomb, they would use it without hesitation. They would use it to conquer the world. They would use it to impose Nazi ideology across the planet through terror and annihilation. So in 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the Manhattan Project, the most ambitious scientific and engineering undertaking in human history up to that point. It was so secret that Vice President Harry Truman didn't even know about it. It consumed more than $2 billion in 1940s money. It employed nearly 1% of the American civilian workforce. It built an entirely new industrial infrastructure from scratch in less than 3 years. The project was located primarily in 3 places: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium was enriched; Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was produced; and Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the bomb itself was designed and assembled. These were entirely new cities built in complete secrecy. Workers showed up, did their jobs, had no idea what they were building, and then left. Security was so tight that even many of the scientists working on different parts of the project didn't know the overall objective was. At the center of it all was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant theoretical physicist from the University of California, who was selected to direct the Los Alamos laboratory. Oppenheimer had to solve an enormous problem. How do you take theoretical knowledge about nuclear fission and translate it into an actual weapon that works? How do you design a bomb that will take subcritical amounts of fissile material and compress them into supercritical conditions so that a fission chain reaction occurs? The approach developed at Los Alamos was called the implosion method. Instead of firing one piece of plutonium at another piece like a gun, which was the design for the uranium bomb, the implosion method used conventional explosives arranged in a sphere around a plutonium core. When those conventional explosives detonated, they would send shock waves inward, compressing the plutonium to a supercritical density, triggering the fission chain reaction. It was an extraordinarily complex engineering problem. Every component had to work perfectly. The timing of the conventional explosives had to be measured in microseconds. The precision of the imploding shock waves had to be calculated within millimeters. The neutron initiator at the center of the core had to work at exactly the right moment. One failure, one miscalculation, one component that didn't work exactly as designed, and the entire bomb would be a dud. For years, Oppenheimer and his team at Los Alamos worked on this problem. They calculated, they designed, they tested components, they built prototypes, they refined and perfected. And by mid-1945, they had what they believed was a working design. But there was one enormous problem. They had never tested a complete assembly. They had never detonated a full-scale nuclear device. They had never actually confirmed that their design worked. The plutonium bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was going to be used in combat against Japan, but before they used it, they absolutely had to know that it would work. Using an untested weapon in combat was unacceptable. If the bomb failed, if it was a dud, the consequences would be catastrophic, militarily and politically. So they decided to conduct a test. In the remote desert of New Mexico, they would detonate a full-scale plutonium bomb in a test they codenamed Trinity. And on July 16, 1945, that test would proceed. By July 15, 1945, the final preparations for the Trinity Test were underway. Scientists and military personnel gathered at observation posts scattered around the test site. Some were positioned 6 miles away. Others were positioned 10 miles away. Still others were 20 or more miles away, prepared to observe and measure the explosion from a safe distance. But the thing about nuclear weapons is that nobody really knew what was safe. Nobody had ever detonated a nuclear device before. The theory said it should be safe. The theory said the explosion would be tremendous but manageable. But theory and reality sometimes diverge, and scientists knew that possibility existed. Edward Teller, the brilliant but controversial physicist who had come to Los Alamos from Hungary, harbored a secret fear that nobody else wanted to publicly acknowledge. He worried, genuinely worried, that the heat and energy released by the nuclear fission might ignite the nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere. He worried that a chain reaction could start that would propagate around the entire planet, engulfing everything in flames, incinerating the Earth itself. It was the ultimate apocalypse scenario, and Teller had done calculations suggesting it might be possible. Of course, Teller's fear was not entirely rational. Nuclear fusion does occur in stars, but the conditions required are specific and cannot be easily recreated on Earth. Hans Bethe, the brilliant German-American physicist and head of the theory division at Los Alamos, conducted calculations showing that the probability of atmospheric ignition was extraordinarily low, essentially zero for practical purposes. But even with Bethe's reassurances, some scientists could not entirely shake the fear. James Compton, one of the Manhattan Project leaders, later revealed that he had set a threshold. If there was more than approximately a 3 in 1 million chance that the Earth would be destroyed, he would refuse to allow the test to proceed. The calculations suggested the odds were somewhat better than that, so the test was authorized. But you can imagine the psychological weight on the scientists gathered in the New Mexico desert on the night of July 15th. They were about to detonate a nuclear weapon. They were about to release the power of the sun onto the Earth. They were about to see something that no human being had ever witnessed before. And there was a non-zero probability that something could go wrong in ways they couldn't anticipate. Several scientists in the days before the test conducted a betting pool on the yield of the bomb, how many kilotons of TNT equivalent the explosion would produce. Edward Teller, the most confident, predicted 45 kilotons. Other scientists made more conservative estimates. Enrico Fermi, the legendary Italian-American physicist who had worked on the first nuclear reactor in Chicago, jokingly suggested they should place bets on whether the explosion would destroy all life on Earth. It was a dark joke, but it reflected the genuine anxiety that permeated the Los Alamos team. They knew they were about to do something unprecedented. They knew the implications were enormous, and they were not entirely certain how it would turn out. The night of July 15th was cold and wet. Wind and rain battered the observation posts. The meteorologists reported that a thunderstorm was moving into the area. If the storm continued, the test would have to be delayed. A delay would have been psychologically devastating to the team, many of whom had been working under crushing pressure for years. But Oppenheimer made the decision to proceed. At approximately 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, the countdown began. Scientists stood in bunkers or at observation positions, holding their breath, waiting for the moment that would either vindicate years of work or reveal catastrophic failure. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, calmly counted down the final seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. At 5:29 and 45 seconds on the morning of July 16, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert, the plutonium implosion device codenamed Gadget detonated. The explosion was unlike anything any observer had ever experienced. The conventional detonators surrounding the plutonium core fired in perfect synchronization, creating shock waves that converged inward. The plutonium was compressed to supercritical density. Neutrons from the initiator at the core triggered the fission chain reaction. In microseconds, billions of uranium and plutonium atoms split apart, releasing energy equivalent to approximately 18.6 kilotons of TNT. The temperature at the center of the fireball exceeded 54 million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the center of the sun. The 100-foot steel tower beneath the bomb was instantly vaporized. The sand and rock beneath the explosion was melted into a glowing green glass called trinitite by the intense heat. The blast wave raced outward across the desert at the speed of sound, then faster than the speed of sound, creating an enormous shock that was felt and heard hundreds of miles away. The fireball rose into the sky with incredible speed, reaching a height of 38,000 feet, more than 7 miles, in just minutes. The mushroom cloud billowed upward, creating the silhouette that would become the defining image of the nuclear age. Witness accounts from the scientists present were extraordinary. Richard Feynman, the brilliant and iconoclastic physicist, had positioned himself about 20 miles away. Most observers had been given special welding goggles to protect their eyes from the intense light, but Feynman, reasoning that he could see the explosion through a truck windshield, had positioned himself behind the windshield instead of using goggles.
He was likely the only person present who saw the explosion with his naked eye. Later, Feynman described what he saw. A big ball of orange, the center that was so bright, becomes a ball of orange that starts to rise and billow a little bit and get a little black around the edges, and then you see it's a big ball of smoke with flashes on the inside of the fire going out, the heat. Enrico Fermi, the legendary physicist, was positioned about 6 miles from the explosion. But Fermi's mind was not primarily on observing the spectacle of the blast. Instead, he was focused on a clever and elegant scientific measurement. He had prepared small pieces of paper, and he expected that approximately 40 seconds after the detonation, the blast wave would reach him. As it passed over him, he dropped the papers and watched how far the blast wind displaced them as they fell. Based on the displacement of the papers, about 2.5 meters, Fermi estimated that the blast had been produced by approximately 10,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Later calculations would show the actual yield was about 18,600 tons, so Fermi's rough estimate, using only scraps of paper and the physics principles in his head, was off by less than a factor of 2. It was an extraordinary demonstration of scientific insight. Joseph Hirschfelder, another physicist present, provided one of the most poetic descriptions of the explosion. All of a sudden, the night turned into day, and it was tremendously bright. The chill turned into warmth. The fireball gradually turned from white to yellow to red as it grew in size and climbed into the sky. After about 5 seconds, the darkness returned, but with the sky and the air filled with a purple glow, just as though we were surrounded by an aurora borealis. We stood there in awe as the blast wave picked up chunks of dirt from the desert soil and soon passed us by. The roar of the explosion was deafening to those within a few miles, but the shock wave traveled hundreds of miles. The light from the explosion was visible for nearly 200 miles. In those first moments after the explosion, as the shock wave was passing and the sound was still reverberating across the mountains, the reaction of the scientists was complex and contradictory. There was celebration. Kenneth Greeson recalled that loud cheering in the group around us broke out. There was relief that the device had worked. There was scientific satisfaction that their calculations had been correct. But there was also something else. There was a profound sense of awe. There was a moment of silence that many observers described as being almost more significant than the celebration. The silence of people who had just witnessed something so tremendous, so overwhelmingly powerful, that their minds were struggling to process it. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, approached Oppenheimer after the shock wave had passed. Bainbridge had been responsible for managing every detail of the test. He had directed thousands of personnel. He had overseen the construction of the test site, and he had just witnessed his responsibility succeed in the most spectacular way imaginable. And in that moment, Bainbridge said something that would become nearly as iconic as the explosion itself. Looking at Oppenheimer, still processing what he had just witnessed, Bainbridge said, "Now we are all sons of bitches." It was not initially understood by everyone as a profound moral statement. Some thought it was simply a crude expression of shock or excitement, but Bainbridge later explained that his statement represented something much deeper. He meant that they had all participated in the creation of a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. They had crossed a threshold. They had unleashed forces that could destroy civilization, and they were not entirely certain how it would turn out. Oppenheimer's own reaction in those immediate moments after the explosion was strikingly subdued. When his brother Frank asked him what he thought, Oppenheimer simply said, "I guess it worked." The man who had devoted the last 2 years of his life to this project, who had made the crucial decisions that made the test possible, who had directed the scientific effort that produced the bomb, simply said, "I guess it worked." It was not a triumphant statement. It was not a celebration of victory. It was a brief acknowledgement that the technical achievement had been successful, But the word guess revealed something profound. Even with all his genius, even with all his theoretical knowledge, even with all his engineering sophistication, Oppenheimer had not been entirely certain the device would work until that moment when the nuclear fire lit up the New Mexico desert.
In the days that followed the Trinity Test, the implications became clear. The United States of America had successfully designed, engineered, and detonated a nuclear weapon. The bomb had worked perfectly. All the calculations had been correct. The implosion design that Oppenheimer's team had developed was flawless. The engineering and construction had been flawless. The coordination of the detonation had been flawless. And more importantly, the United States had accomplished this feat in complete secrecy. The entire project had been conducted without the knowledge of the American public, without the knowledge of Congress, without the knowledge of the Soviet Union. The Manhattan Project had been so secure that not even Vice President Harry Truman knew about it until he became president after Roosevelt's death. This was an achievement of extraordinary scope. The Manhattan Project had employed nearly 130,000 people. It had required the construction of entirely new cities. It had required the development of new industrial processes. It had required breakthroughs in theoretical physics, in engineering, in metallurgy, in chemistry. It had required the coordination of the greatest scientific minds in the world, all working toward a single objective. And it had succeeded. America had the bomb. America had proven that it possessed the technological sophistication, the scientific knowledge, the engineering capability, and the organizational capacity to create a weapon that literally transformed human civilization. Within 3 weeks of the Trinity Test, the United States would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb on Hiroshima, codenamed Little Boy, was a uranium gun-type design that had never been tested in full-scale form. It was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and detonated with a force of approximately 15 kilotons. Approximately 70,000 people were killed instantly. Many more died in the following days and weeks from radiation sickness and burns. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb that had been tested at Trinity, was dropped on Nagasaki. It detonated with a force of approximately 22 kilotons, killing approximately 40,000 people immediately. The atomic bombing of Japan served multiple purposes from the American perspective. It demonstrated the awesome power of the weapon. It accelerated Japan's surrender. But perhaps most importantly, from a strategic perspective, it demonstrated to the entire world, and particularly to the Soviet Union, that the United States possessed a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. The message was clear. American technological innovation had produced something that no other nation possessed. American engineering had created a weapon that was beyond anything that any other nation had the capability to construct. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, exactly 1 month after the Trinity Test. The Pacific War ended, World War II was over, and the United States stood as the undisputed technological superpower of the world. But the implications of the atomic bomb went far beyond the immediate military situation. The bomb represented something even more significant than a new weapon. It represented American scientific and technological supremacy. It represented the culmination of American research, American innovation, American engineering genius. It proved that when the American system, American capitalism, American science, American democracy focused its resources and its talent on a specific objective, it could achieve things that seemed impossible to everyone else. The world had entered the nuclear age, and America had led the way. Now let us consider what was happening in Moscow at this same moment. Let us consider the perspective of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, the man who had forced his nation through revolutionary transformation, who had defeated Hitler's armies on the Eastern Front, who had lost more soldiers than any other nation in the war against Nazi Germany. Stalin had not known about the Manhattan Project. Or rather, Stalin had suspected something was happening, and his intelligence services had confirmed his suspicions. Soviet spies working within the Manhattan Project, most notably the physicist Klaus Fuchs and the military officer David Greenglass, had provided detailed information to Soviet intelligence about the American bomb program. Stalin had known that the Americans were working on an atomic weapon, but knowing that the Americans had successfully created one, knowing that they had successfully tested one, knowing that they had dropped it on Japanese cities, knowing that this weapon represented something that the Soviet Union could not duplicate in the foreseeable future. On July 17, 1945, the day after the Trinity Test, Truman and Stalin met at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. Truman, who had just been informed of the successful Trinity Test, casually mentioned to Stalin that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Truman was deliberately vague, using language that suggested a conventional weapon rather than explicitly saying atomic bomb. Stalin's response was to nod and say that he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. On the surface, his response seemed casual, almost indifferent. Truman was confused and puzzled by Stalin's lack of reaction. Why wasn't Stalin shocked? Why wasn't he awed by the knowledge that the Americans had developed a new superweapon? The answer was that Stalin already knew. His intelligence services had informed him about the Trinity Test almost immediately. Soviet spies had reported that an enormous explosion had occurred in New Mexico. American intercepts had captured references to a successful atomic test. Stalin knew that the Americans had the bomb, even though Truman didn't realize that Stalin knew. But that knowledge, that moment when Stalin learned that the Americans had successfully created a nuclear weapon, that moment was profoundly shocking to the Soviet dictator. According to historical accounts, Stalin's first response was to turn to his closest associates and say, "They didn't tell us about the bomb. That means they don't trust us, and we can't afford to fall behind on this." Then, as the full implications sunk in, Stalin issued orders to his scientists and military leaders that would reshape the entire Soviet Union. He told his intelligence chief, Lavrenti Beria, and his scientists that they needed to develop a Soviet atomic bomb as quickly as possible. It was not a suggestion, it was an absolute command. Beria, who controlled the Soviet secret police and who was as feared and despised as Stalin himself, was placed in charge of the entire atomic program. "You must have the bomb," Stalin told Beria in a statement that became famous among Soviet historians. "Whatever it costs, whatever resources you need, you must have the bomb, and it must be ready as quickly as possible." Beria understood the implicit threat. If he failed, if the Soviet Union fell too far behind the Americans, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Americans had the bomb. The Americans could use it against the Soviet Union. The Americans might use it to threaten Soviet interests around the world. And the Soviet Union, the great communist powerhouse that Stalin had built through revolution and bloodshed and terror, could not afford to remain weaponless in a nuclear-armed world. In August of 1945, immediately after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, Stalin authorized the Soviet Politburo to create a special committee to manage all work on the use of intra-atomic energy of uranium. The committee was headed by Lavrenti Beria, one of the most powerful and feared men in the Soviet Union. Beria had spent years running Stalin's secret police. He had ordered the torture and execution of thousands of Soviet citizens. He had organized forced labor camps. He was a man without conscience, without mercy, a man capable of anything.
And now Beria was in charge of making sure the Soviet Union developed a nuclear bomb. He mobilized scientists, engineers, and workers on a scale that was almost imaginable. He recruited German scientists from the portions of Germany that the Soviet Union had conquered. He organized uranium mining operations across the Soviet Union and in newly conquered territories like East Germany. He built research facilities and testing sites. He pushed Soviet scientists relentlessly to accelerate the development of their own atomic weapon.
By August 29, 1949, roughly 4 years after the Trinity Test, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed RDS-1 or Joe-1 by American intelligence analysts. The Soviet bomb had a yield of approximately 22 kilotons, nearly identical to the Fat Man bomb that had been tested at Trinity and dropped on Nagasaki. The American response to the Soviet test was one of shock and alarm. American leaders had estimated that the Soviet Union would not develop a nuclear weapon until at least 1953, perhaps not until 1954 or later. When American detection systems discovered evidence of the Soviet test, the reaction in Washington was one of urgency and fear. The American atomic monopoly, the advantage that the United States had enjoyed for 4 years, was over. The Soviet Union was now a nuclear power. President Truman immediately authorized acceleration of American nuclear weapons development. He directed the development of thermonuclear, hydrogen weapons, weapons with destructive power orders of magnitude greater than the atomic bombs that had been dropped on Japan. He authorized massive increases in military spending. The nuclear arms race had begun. But the key point is this. The Soviet Union's ability to develop an atomic bomb in just 4 years, an achievement that shocked American intelligence analysts, was made possible only by the espionage that had given them access to American designs and calculations. Without that espionage, without the detailed intelligence provided by Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass and other Soviet agents, the Soviet Union might have required 5 or 6 or 7 years to develop their bomb. They might have encountered obstacles and dead ends that would have taken years to overcome. As it was, the Soviet scientists, working from American designs and with unlimited resources mobilized by Stalin and Beria, accomplished in 4 years what the Americans had accomplished in nearly 3 years. But the American 3 years had been the first 3 years when there was no blueprint, no design to copy, no prior successful example to follow. The Trinity Test had revealed American technological supremacy. It had demonstrated that the United States could accomplish something that the Soviet Union could not accomplish for years. It had shown that American science, American engineering, American organizational capacity exceeded what the Soviet Union possessed. But the Soviet response had been to mobilize every resource, to accept no excuses, to work relentlessly to close the gap. And Stalin, by accepting no less than absolute success from Beria and Kurchatov and the Soviet scientists, had forced the development of a Soviet bomb in record time. The rivalry that began with the Trinity Test would define the Cold War for the next 40 years. It would drive the nuclear arms race. It would lead to the development of more and more powerful weapons. It would create the possibility of mutual assured destruction. It would shape international relations and geopolitics for decades. But in that moment, in July and August of 1945, when the Americans successfully tested their bomb and the Soviets realized they were years behind in acquiring nuclear weapons, the fundamental trajectory of the post-war world was set. America had the bomb. America had proven its technological superiority, and the Soviet Union had no choice but to mobilize every resource to catch up. But even as celebrations erupted across America, even as American leaders realized that the atomic bomb had given the United States a technological advantage that seemed insurmountable, the scientists who had created the bomb were beginning to grapple with the moral implications of what they had done.
In the months after Trinity, as the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as the scale of the destruction became clear, as the human cost of the weapon became visible to the world, Oppenheimer began to change. The man who had been so focused on the technical challenge of creating the bomb, who had driven his team relentlessly to achieve their objective, began to think deeply about what his achievement meant. In a 1965 television interview, more than 20 years after the Trinity Test, Oppenheimer recalled, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.'" I suppose we all thought that one way or another. The Bhagavad Gita is one of the most profound spiritual texts in human civilization. It is a dialogue between Prince Arjuna and the god Vishnu about the nature of duty, about the morality of taking action that causes suffering, about the paradoxes of a warrior's path. Oppenheimer's invocation of this ancient text suggested that he understood something fundamental about what he had done. But there was something more troubling about what Oppenheimer had done. In the months and years after the war, Oppenheimer had begun to advocate for international control of nuclear weapons. He opposed the development of hydrogen weapons. He spoke about the need for global cooperation to manage nuclear power. He seemed to be suggesting that the creation of the bomb had been a mistake, or at least that the implications of the bomb needed to be managed carefully. The American government, particularly under President Truman and his hardline anti-communist advisors, became suspicious of Oppenheimer. They began to suspect him of being a communist sympathizer. They investigated him. They discovered that in the 1930s he had associated with communists and communist-sympathizing intellectuals. They discovered that he had made contributions to organizations that were alleged to have communist connections. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission held a hearing to determine whether Oppenheimer's security clearance should be revoked. The hearing was essentially a trial, though it did not take place in a court of law. Oppenheimer was questioned about his past associations, about his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, about his political views. He was ultimately found to be a security risk, and his security clearance was revoked. The irony was profound. The man who had created the atomic bomb for America, who had led the project that gave America its technological advantage, who had sacrificed years of his life to the effort, was now being investigated and discredited by his own government, because he had expressed moral doubts about the weapon he had created. But Oppenheimer was not the only scientist grappling with these doubts. Many of the Manhattan Project scientists began in the years after the war to advocate for nuclear arms control, for international cooperation on nuclear weapons, for measures to prevent the nuclear arms race. Leo Szilard, the brilliant Hungarian-American physicist who had helped convince Einstein to write the letter that initiated the Manhattan Project in the first place, became an advocate for nuclear disarmament. Szilard wrote extensively about the dangers of the nuclear arms race. He warned that the development of hydrogen bombs would make the world even more dangerous. Hans Bethe, the theorist who had provided the reassurance about atmospheric ignition, also became concerned about the implications of nuclear weapons. In later years, Bethe would oppose the development of new nuclear weapons and would advocate for arms control measures. Many of the scientists who had celebrated the Trinity Test initially found themselves in the years that followed deeply troubled by what the bomb represented. They had accomplished something extraordinary from a technical perspective. They had solved one of the greatest scientific and engineering problems of the age. But they had also created a weapon that could destroy civilization. And that knowledge weighed heavily on their consciences. This was the moral paradox of Trinity. It was an achievement of extraordinary scientific and engineering brilliance, but it was also the creation of a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, and the scientists who had created it had to live with that contradiction. But while American leaders were celebrating the Trinity Test as a triumph of American technological and engineering prowess, while Stalin and the Soviet Union were mobilizing to catch up, while Oppenheimer and other scientists were grappling with the moral implications of what they had created, there were others who were suffering in silence. Approximately 500,000 people lived within 150 miles of the Trinity Test site. Most of them had no idea that a nuclear bomb had been tested in their vicinity. Most had heard the explosion and seen the light, but they had been told it was an accident involving conventional explosives. The official story was a cover-up.
What nobody told these people was that radioactive fallout from the Trinity explosion had rained down on them. Iodine-131, strontium-90, cesium-137, and other radioactive isotopes had contaminated the air, the soil, the grass, the water. Dairy cows had eaten contaminated grass and produced contaminated milk. Children had drunk that milk, and iodine-131 had accumulated in their thyroid glands. Exposure to high levels of iodine-131, particularly in childhood, causes thyroid cancer. It causes other radiation-related illnesses. It causes genetic damage that can be transmitted to future generations. In the months and years after Trinity, doctors in communities like the Tularosa Basin, in areas that would later be identified as downwind of the test site, began to notice disturbing health trends. Cancer rates were climbing. Thyroid disease was becoming common. Birth defects were increasing. Families that had been normal and healthy found themselves devastated by disease. The people affected became known as downwinders, those who lived downwind of the test sites and were exposed to radioactive fallout. Many of them had no idea for decades that the source of their illness was radiation exposure from Trinity. The government kept it secret. The scientists involved in the Manhattan Project either didn't know about the health impacts on civilians or knew and said nothing. Tina Cordova is a downwinder from the Tularosa Basin. Her father was exposed to Trinity fallout as a young man. Her mother was exposed. Her grandparents were exposed. Her siblings developed cancer. Cancer became a family norm, not a tragedy, but an expectation. Tina herself developed thyroid cancer. In 2016, Tina helped establish the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium to document the health impacts of Trinity radiation exposure and to seek justice and compensation for those who had been harmed. The consortium's research found that among people who had lived in the fallout zone in 1945, rates of thyroid disease and cancer were far, far higher than would be expected in a comparable population with no radiation exposure. But for decades, the government denied that there was a problem. They maintained that the radiation exposure had been within safe limits, even as epidemiological studies showed dramatically elevated cancer rates among downwinders. It was not until 1990, 45 years after the Trinity Test, that Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which acknowledged that people exposed to radiation from nuclear weapons testing had been harmed and deserved compensation. But even RECA provided limited compensation and excluded many communities most heavily affected by Trinity fallout. The downwinders represented the hidden cost of the Trinity Test, the cost that was not celebrated, the cost that was not acknowledged at the time, the cost that was suppressed and denied for decades. While America celebrated its technological triumph, while Stalin feared American superiority, while the nuclear age began, the people who lived downwind of the test site were suffering from radiation exposure that the government had not warned them about and did not acknowledge for nearly 50 years. The Trinity Test stands as one of the most significant moments in human history.
It represented the culmination of extraordinary scientific and engineering achievement. It demonstrated American technological supremacy. It changed the course of World War II. It terrified the Soviet Union and set in motion the nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War. But it also represented something more troubling, the moment when humanity acquired the power to destroy itself. The moment when a handful of scientists and military leaders could make decisions that would reshape the entire world. The moment when the weapons of war crossed from being terrifyingly destructive to being apocalyptically destructive. The scientists who created the bomb understood this, even if not all of them acknowledged it immediately. Oppenheimer, in his later years, came to see the Trinity Test as a moment when human knowledge crossed a threshold from which there was no return. We had opened a door that could never be closed. We had released a force that could not be uncontrolled. And yet, paradoxically, the very fact that the bomb was so terrible, so horrifying, so incomprehensibly destructive, may have prevented World War III. During the Cold War, nuclear-armed superpowers faced off repeatedly, in Korea, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, yet they never directly engaged in nuclear warfare. The mutual fear of nuclear annihilation created a kind of deterrence that prevented direct conflict between the superpowers. But the Trinity Test's legacy extends far beyond military strategy and international politics. It transformed human consciousness. It created the possibility of existential risk from human-made weapons. It forced humanity to contemplate the possibility of its own annihilation. It created an anxiety that seeped into popular culture, literature, philosophy, and everyday consciousness. For generations after Trinity, people grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, aware that nuclear war could destroy civilization at any moment. School children practiced duck and cover drills, as if hiding under desks could protect them from a nuclear bomb. Families built fallout shelters in their basements. The threat of nuclear annihilation was a constant in the background of Cold War consciousness. And yet, 80 years later, nuclear weapons still exist. The United States still possesses thousands of thermonuclear weapons. So does Russia. So do other nations. The Trinity Test opened a door that has never been closed. The genie was released from the bottle, and nobody has been able to put it back in.